She rescued a Mafia boss's son from Quicksand. Then this happened. Some debts can never be repaid. And sometimes, saving a life is the most dangerous thing you'll ever do. The 19th of May, 2011. The pinelands of southern New Jersey stretch over 1 million acres of wild, forgotten land. Cedar swamps, scrubby oaks, and the kind of silence that makes you remember how small you really are. Most people know about Atlantic City, with its casinos and bright lights, just an hour southeast. But the pinelands? That's a different world entirely, and buried deep inside that world are the blue holes, former sand pits with water so clear it looks safe, but underneath, pure danger. The edges are made of sugar sand that shifts and swallows anything that gets too close. Rachel Hayes knew this land better than most people knew their own backyards. At 32, she ran a small environmental nonprofit that nobody had ever heard of, and barely anyone funded. Her job was simple but endless. Protect the pinelands ecosystem. That meant water samples, soil tests, and long days walking through places where cell phone signals went to die. She wasn't doing it for fame or money. She was doing it because somebody had to. That afternoon the heat was unexpected. Mid-May shouldn't feel like summer, but the sun was relentless, and Rachel was crouched near the edge of the Winslow Fish and Wildlife Management Area, taking water samples near one of the restricted blue holes. Her equipment was basic. Her truck was old. Her clothes were practical. This was routine, unglamorous, necessary, and then she heard it. A scream. High-pitched, desperate, and terrified. Rachel froze. Her heart kicked against her ribs. Screams in the pinelands meant one thing. Someone was in serious trouble. She dropped her sample kit and ran toward the sound, her boots pounding against the uneven ground. Branches scratched her arms. Her breath came fast. And when she broke through the tree line, she saw him. A boy, maybe 12 years old, chest deep in a pool of wet sand that looked deceptively solid. His face was pale, streaked with dirt and fear. His eyes were wide, and he was sinking. Slowly, inevitably, quicksand. Most people think quicksand works like it does in the movies. You step in, you go under, it's over. But the reality is worse because it's slower. The sand is saturated and liquefied. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink. And this kid was struggling hard. Rachel didn't panic. She couldn't afford to. Panic killed people out here. She scanned the area, her mind working fast. She couldn't step onto that sand. If she did, she'd sink too, and then they'd both be dead. She needed leverage. She needed physics. Her eyes landed on a 12-foot section of treated lumber, half buried in the underbrush, probably debris from an old fence. She grabbed it, dragged it to the edge of the pool, and dropped flat onto her stomach. "Hey," she yelled. "Look at me. Stop moving." The boy's head snapped toward her. His breathing was ragged, panicked. "Listen to me," Rachel said, her voice calm and firm. "The more you move, the faster you sink. I need you to stay completely still. Can you do that?" He nodded, barely. His lips were trembling. Rachel slid the lumber out across the surface of the quicksand, inch by inch, keeping her weight distributed on solid ground. The wood floated on the semi-liquid sand, creating a bridge. She anchored one end against a thick pitch pine trunk, using her own body weight to stabilize it. "Grab the wood," she instructed. "Don't pull. Just hold it against your chest and breathe. You're going to float up slowly. Trust me." It took 2 hours, 2 agonizing, painstaking hours. Rachel talked him through every movement. Strip off the heavy gold chain around his neck. Let go of the expensive leather boots weighing him down. Shift his weight, inch by inch, onto the board. The quicksand released him slowly, grudgingly. When he finally collapsed onto solid ground, he was shaking so hard he could barely speak. His clothes were drenched in sandy muck. His face was ghost white. But he was alive. Rachel checked him for injuries, her hands steady despite the adrenaline still flooding her system. "Who are you?" she asked gently. "Are you all right? Where are your parents?" The boy clutched a small, tarnished silver locket that had somehow stayed around his neck. His eyes were distant, still processing what had just happened. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and carefully rehearsed. "My name is Alessio Gentile. I got lost. I need to get back to my uncle's house in Vineland." Rachel studied him. The expensive clothes under the filth. The way he held himself, even in shock, like someone who'd been taught not to show weakness. This wasn't just some kid who wandered off a hiking trail. But she didn't push. She gave him her jacket, loaded him into her beat-up truck, and drove him to a small gas station on the outskirts of Vineland. She watched as he made a call from the payphone. 12 minutes later, a black Cadillac Escalade pulled into the lot. Custom. Armored, if Rachel had to guess. A man the size of a small building stepped out, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her annual salary. He snatched the boy into the vehicle without a word. No thank you. No explanation. Just gone. Rachel stood there for a moment, watching the Escalade disappear down the road. She figured she'd just saved some rich kid from an embarrassing accident his family would want to forget. She drove back to her office, filed her water samples, and moved on with her life. She had no idea what she'd just set in motion. I'm telling you this story from my apartment here in New York, and I can't help but wonder, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. I want to know where this story is reaching. And here's something to think about. Rachel Hayes just saved a stranger's life without knowing who he was or what world he belonged to. If you found someone in danger, no context, no information, would you risk everything to save them, or would you walk away? There's no right answer, just your answer. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and make sure you're subscribed because what happens next changes everything. Share this with someone who loves a story that makes them think. The next morning, Alessio Vitiello stood in his father's study and told the truth. Not all of it. Just enough. Domenico Vitiello's home wasn't tucked away in some gated community where neighbors pretended not to know what you did for a living. It sat on an exclusive peninsula in Brigantine, New Jersey, surrounded by sand and salt air, with a direct view of the Atlantic Ocean. The kind of place where privacy wasn't just valued, it was enforced. The study was quiet. Leather chairs, dark wood, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over water that stretched forever. Domenico sat behind his desk, a man in his mid-50s who carried authority the way some men carry weapons. Close, always within reach. He listened as his son recounted the incident, the restricted area, the quicksand, the woman who appeared out of nowhere and spent 2 hours pulling him back from death. Alessio's voice was steady, controlled, but Domenico could see the fear still lingering behind his son's eyes. Fear that had nothing to do with the sand. You used your mother's name, Domenico said when Alessio finished. It wasn't a question. Gentile, like you taught me. Domenico nodded slowly. The boy had done exactly what he was supposed to do. Never give the real name. Never expose the family. Even at 12 years old, even terrified and sinking, Alessio had followed the rules. But that wasn't what occupied Domenico's thoughts. This woman, he said, leaning back in his chair. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask questions. She just saved you and walked away. Yes. And your cousins ran. Alessio's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Enzo and Rocco had already received their punishment the night before. A beating they would carry in their bones for the rest of their lives. Domenico was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, thoughtful. She put her life at risk for my blood, he said. That means something. Across the room, Frankie Bellini, Domenico's consigliere, shifted slightly. Frankie was a man who kept ledgers in his head. Numbers, debts, favors owed and collected. He understood what Domenico was about to say before the words even left his mouth. She owns you now, Frankie said carefully. Domenico's eyes went cold. She saved the boy. That means she owns me. And nobody owns Domenico Vitiello. The weight of that statement settled over the room like stone. This wasn't about gratitude. It wasn't even about honor. Not really. It was about control. About power. About a man who had spent his entire life making sure he owed nothing to anyone, and now a stranger held a debt over his head that couldn't be ignored. 2 days later, Frankie walked into a small, run-down office building in Hamilton, New Jersey. The sign on the door read, Pinelands Conservation Initiative. Inside, the space was cramped and underfunded. Mismatched filing cabinets, a desk covered in maps and reports, the faint smell of coffee that had been sitting too long. Rachel Hayes looked up from her paperwork, surprised. Frankie didn't introduce himself. He simply placed a manila envelope on her desk. Thick. Heavy. What's this? Rachel asked. Frankie didn't smile. Paid. He turned and walked out before she could say another word. Rachel stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. Inside was $50,000 in cash, crisp bills, neatly stacked, and a single word written on a slip of paper. Paid. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at the money. This wasn't right. She hadn't saved that boy for a reward. She hadn't even thought about payment. She did it because someone needed help, and she was the only one there. She sealed the envelope back up, wrote return to sender across the front, and included a letter, short, direct. I saved him because it was the right thing to do, not for payment. I don't want your money. When Frankie returned to Domenico with the envelope and the letter, he placed both on the desk without comment. Domenico read the letter once, twice. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around him. She refused, Frankie said, and there was something close to respect in his voice. Not many people refused money from Domenico Vidiello. It was the kind of decision that either made you very smart or very stupid, and it was often hard to tell which until it was too late. Domenico set the letter down and looked out the window at the ocean. For a long time, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, calm, and somehow, that made it worse. She refused the payment. That means the debt is still open. A debt of life for a debt of life. She will call it in when she needs it most. And that is a loose thread. Frankie understood. Loose threads had to be tied, or cut. What do you want me to do? Frankie asked. Domenico turned from the window and looked at his consigliere. Watch her. I want to know where she goes, who she talks to, what she cares about, everything. For how long? Until the thread is tied. And so it began, quietly, carefully. Rachel Hayes went back to her work, her water samples, her endless reports that nobody read. She forgot about the boy with the expensive clothes and the terrified eyes. She forgot about the silent bodyguard and the envelope full of cash she'd sent back. She moved through her life completely unaware that she had become a piece on a board she didn't even know existed. A board controlled by a man who never left debts unpaid and never forgot a face. For the next 10 years, Rachel Hayes had no idea someone was watching her every move. The 14th of March 2021. 10 years had passed, and Rachel Hayes was still fighting battles most people didn't know existed. She was 42 now. Her nonprofit still operated out of the same cramped office in Hamilton, still survived on grants that barely covered rent. Her work had become more complex over the years, more tangled in bureaucracy and land disputes. The Pinelands weren't just about protecting trees and water anymore. They were about money, development, corporate interests that saw 1 million acres of protected wilderness as wasted opportunity. For the past 6 months, Rachel had been buried in a land ownership report that nobody had asked for but desperately needed. Shell corporations buying up parcels on the edges of restricted zones, permits approved through channels that didn't quite make sense, and underneath it all, a pattern she couldn't ignore. Someone was using the Pinelands as a dumping ground. The evidence was in the soil samples, in the water tests that came back wrong, in the dead zones where nothing grew anymore. She traced it back through layers of paperwork, dummy companies, and falsified permits until she found a name. Scalia Environmental Solutions. Owned by Anthony Scalia, also known as Tony Scraps, in certain circles Rachel knew nothing about. She didn't know he was connected. She didn't know that filing her report with the New Jersey State Environmental Commission would set off alarms in places where alarms meant action. Fast, brutal action. She just knew it was her job, so she filed it, official, documented, undeniable. 2 days later, Rachel was driving home on the Atlantic City Expressway, just past exit 12. It was late. The road was nearly empty. Her headlights cut through darkness that felt heavier than usual, pressing against the windows of her old truck. She didn't see the black sedan until it was too late. It came up behind her fast. Too fast. No headlights. And then it wasn't behind her anymore. It was beside her, swerving hard into her lane. Metal screamed against metal. Her truck lurched sideways. She fought the wheel, her heart slamming against her ribs, but the sedan hit her again, harder this time, and her truck spun out of control. The guardrail rushed up to meet her. Glass shattered. The world flipped. Pain exploded through her body in ways she didn't have words for. And then nothing. She woke up in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and fear. Atlanticare Regional Medical Center, Atlantic City. Her body was a map of injuries she didn't want to inventory. Broken ribs, concussion, Lacerations across her face and arms. Her left wrist was in a cast. Every breath hurt. A nurse told her she was lucky to be alive. The police had been by earlier. They'd be back with questions. Road rage, they said. An untraceable vehicle. Happens more than you'd think. But Rachel knew better. Her laptop was gone. The one with all her raw data, her backup files, everything that wasn't already submitted to the state commission, taken from the wreckage before the ambulance even arrived. Someone wanted her silenced, and they'd almost succeeded. She lay in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles, trying to breathe through the pain and the fear. She had no family, no close friends who could help her navigate this. She'd spent her whole life fighting for land that couldn't fight back, and now she was the one who needed protection. That's when the memory surfaced, fragmented, distant, like something from another lifetime. A boy, sinking, her voice steady and calm. A massive man in an expensive suit, taking the child without a word. And before that man left, Rachel had pressed something into his hand. A small wooden pine cone she'd carved from a piece of pitch pine. A thank you gift for a boy who'd survived something impossible. She'd insisted. The man had taken it without expression, tucked it into his pocket, and disappeared. Rachel didn't know why she remembered it now. Maybe it was the pain medication. Maybe it was desperation. But something in her gut told her that connection, that strange moment a decade ago, was the only card she had left to play. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers. It took 3 tries to find the number. Renaissance Casino and Spa, Atlantic City. A legitimate business. Public. Traceable. The line rang twice before someone answered. Male voice. Professional. Detached. Renaissance Casino, how may I direct your call? Rachel's throat was dry. Her voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. I need to leave a message. Just 3 words. Someone there will understand. A pause. I'm not sure The Pinelands Pinecone. Silence on the other end. Long enough that Rachel thought maybe she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd just revealed herself to the very people who wanted her dead. The voice came back. Different now. Focused. Stay where you are. The line went dead. Rachel let her phone fall onto the bed. Her whole body was shaking. She had no idea if she'd just saved her life or ended it. All she knew was that she'd run out of options, out of safe choices, out of everything except a decade-old memory and a gamble that someone, somewhere, still remembered. 30 minutes later, the door to her hospital room opened. No nurse, no doctor, no police officer with questions. Silvio stepped inside, older now, but unmistakable. The same massive frame, the same expensive suit, the same expression that gave away nothing. He pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask what happened. He just looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and said one word. Talk. Let's pause here because I need to know what you're thinking. Rachel just made a choice. She reached out to the one person who might be dangerous, the one connection to a world she doesn't understand. She's broken, alone, and desperate. Here's my question. When you're backed into a corner with nowhere to turn, do you trust the devil you don't know, or do you face the danger alone? Some of you will say she's smart, using every resource to survive. Others will say she just made the worst mistake of her life. Drop your perspective in the comments. I want to see the debate. And listen, if this story is pulling you in, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share it with your friends, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment with your thoughts. The algorithm only shows this to more people if you engage. Let's build this community together. The safe house near Sicklerville didn't look like much from the outside. Single story. Nondescript. The kind of place you'd drive past without noticing. But inside, it was fortified like a vault. Reinforced doors. Security cameras in every corner. Windows that didn't open. Rachel sat in a leather chair that was too comfortable for the conversation she was about to have. Her ribs still ached. Her wrist throbbed beneath the cast. But she was here, and that meant she was still alive. For now. Domenico Vitiello sat across from her, and Rachel understood immediately why people feared this man. It wasn't his size or his voice. It was the stillness. The way he looked at her like he was calculating the exact value of her life down to the cent. Silvio stood by the door, silent as a statue. You called in the debt, Domenico said. Not a question, a statement of fact. Rachel met his gaze. She'd spent 10 years staring down developers and politicians who thought intimidation was a negotiating tactic. She wasn't going to fold now. I need protection, and I need help finishing my work. Your environmental report. Yes. Domenico leaned back slightly. The one that exposed Anthony Scalia's operations. So he knew. Of course he knew. Rachel's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. I didn't know who he was. I just followed the data. Ignorance doesn't erase consequences, Domenico said. Scalia wanted you dead. Someone made that happen. And someone made sure I survived. Rachel replied, her eyes sharp. That wooden pine cone I gave your man 10 years ago. You kept it, which means you've been tracking me this whole time. A flicker of something crossed Domenico's face. Respect, maybe, or amusement. You're smarter than I expected. I'm alive because I pay attention. Domenico studied her for a long moment. Protection, help with your work. That's your price? That's my price. Done. He said it without hesitation, and that should have been Rachel's first warning. You'll work for me now. Security consultant. Legitimate cover. You'll have access to resources your nonprofit never dreamed of. In return, you do what I tell you, when I tell you. Understood? Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but she never got the chance. The door slammed open with enough force to rattle the frame. The man who walked in moved like violence contained in expensive clothing. Lean, sharp, every step deliberate. His suit was tailored perfectly, dark gray with a black shirt beneath, no tie. His hair was dark, slightly too long, brushing the collar. But it was his eyes that stopped Rachel's breath. Cold, calculating, the kind of eyes that had seen things they could never unsee. And yet, somewhere beneath that hardness, Rachel saw something achingly familiar. The boy, the terrified 12-year-old she'd pulled from the quicksand. Her heart stuttered in her chest. Alessio? He didn't look at her, not yet. His focus was entirely on his father, and the tension between them filled the room like a living thing. You won't be needing her, Papa, Alessio said, his voice smooth and cold as winter water. I already took care of the Scalia problem. He's finished. Domenico's expression didn't change, but Rachel felt the shift in power, saw it in the way Silvio's posture stiffened, in the way the air itself seemed to tighten. You want to run the show, boy? Domenico asked, his tone almost lazy. You think you're ready? Am I? Alessio stepped further into the room, and now, finally, his gaze slid to Rachel. The impact of that look nearly knocked her backwards. It wasn't the frightened child she remembered. This was a man who commanded rooms and bent wills and made people disappear. Who do you think was driving the car that hit her on the expressway? The silence that fell was absolute. Rachel's blood turned to ice. Her mind raced, trying to process what he'd just said. The black sedan, the deliberate hits, the way her truck had spun out of control. Alessio. He'd orchestrated it. You tried to kill me? Her voice came out strangled, betrayed. No. Alessio's eyes never left his father's face. I saved your life. You ran her off the road, Domenico said, and there was something dangerous in his voice now, something that made Rachel want to run despite her injuries. Because you ordered her execution, Alessio shot back. Scalia came to you 2 days after she filed that report, asked for permission to handle the problem. You gave it. A clean removal. No witnesses, no loose ends. His jaw tightened. You signed her death warrant because she knew too much about operations you protect. Operations that pay you. Rachel's head spun. She looked at Domenico, and the lack of denial on his face told her everything. So I did it first, Alessio continued, his voice dropping lower. On my terms, I used a driver I controlled, someone who would injure her enough to make it convincing, but not kill her. I knew the accident would force her to reach out. I knew she'd remember, and I knew she'd call. You've been watching her, Domenico said. For 10 years, just like you ordered. Alessio finally turned his full attention to Rachel, and the weight of his gaze made her skin burn. You saved my life when I was 12 years old. You didn't ask for anything, didn't want anything. You just did it because it was right. His voice softened, just barely. Nobody does that in my world. Nobody. Rachel couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. This man, this dangerous, beautiful man, had been protecting her from his own father. Alessio turned back to Domenico. She doesn't belong to you. The debt isn't yours to collect. It's mine. She saved me, which means she's mine to protect. Mine to control. He took another step forward, and there was no mistaking the challenge in his stance. You don't control this debt anymore, Papa. I do. The power in the room shifted completely. Rachel sat frozen, caught between two predators circling each other, and she realized with shocking clarity that she'd just become the center of a war she didn't understand. And the boy she'd saved had just claimed her as his. Domenico left without another word. The door closed behind him with a finality that made Rachel's stomach drop. Silvio followed, leaving her alone with Alessio Vitiello in a room that suddenly felt too small. Rachel's hands were shaking. She pressed them against her thighs, willing them to stop. Everything she thought she understood about the last 10 years had just shattered and reassembled into something unrecognizable. Alessio moved to the window, his back to her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. How much? Rachel finally asked, her voice rough. How much have you been watching? Everything. He didn't turn around. Your office, your fieldwork, the grants you applied for, the ones that got approved. He paused. The ones that didn't. The implication hit her like a fist. You've been funding my work. Some of it, through channels you'd never trace. Now he did turn, and the look on his face was complex, layered. You refused the money 10 years ago, but you couldn't refuse grants from environmental foundations that didn't know where their donations actually came from. Rachel felt her anger rising, hot and sharp. You manipulated my entire career. I kept you alive. His voice was quiet but absolute. My father tracks threats, eliminates loose ends. You were both. The only reason you're still breathing is because I made sure of it. By controlling me. By protecting you. He crossed the room, closing the distance between them, and Rachel's breath caught. He moved like water, smooth and inevitable. When he stopped, he was close enough that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow. Close enough to feel the heat radiating from him. You saved my life when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. I've been ensuring yours ever since. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning Rachel wasn't ready to examine. Why? She whispered. Alessio's eyes searched her face, and something shifted in his expression. The hardness cracked, just slightly, revealing something raw underneath. Because you looked at me like I was human. Not a Vitiello. Not an heir or a weapon or a tool. Just a terrified kid who needed help. His jaw tightened. Do you know how rare that is in my world? Do you know what it means to be 12 years old and realize the only person who ever saw you as just a person was a stranger you'd never see again? Rachel's chest ached. She could see it now, the truth she'd missed. This wasn't just about debt or protection. This was about a boy who'd been drowning long before he stepped into that quicksand. A boy who'd spent a decade remembering the woman who pulled him out. I'm not that stranger anymore, she said softly. You've made sure of that. No. Alessio's voice dropped lower, rougher. You're not. The air between them felt charged, electric. Rachel knew she should step back, put distance between herself and this man who'd upended her entire existence. But she couldn't move. Couldn't look away. For 10 years, Alessio continued, I built something separate from my father. Quieter, cleaner, money laundering through real estate. Yes, but also legitimate businesses. Environmental acquisitions, land conservation trusts. A bitter smile touched his lips. I learned from you, watched how you fought for land nobody else cared about. How you found value in protection instead of exploitation. You used my work to build your empire. I used your principles to build something better than what I inherited. He reached up, and Rachel's heart stuttered as his fingers brushed a strand of hair away from her face. The touch was gentle, devastating. You think I don't know what I am? What this world makes people into? But you, his voice softened. You made me think maybe there's something worth protecting beyond power and territory. Rachel should say something, should push him away, should remind him that he orchestrated a car accident that broke her ribs and could have killed her. But all she could focus on was the way he was looking at her. Like she was oxygen and he'd been holding his breath for a decade. This is wrong, she managed. You're 10 years younger than me. You run a criminal organization. You've been controlling my life without my knowledge or consent. I know. I should be terrified of you. You should be. I should walk away right now. Alessio's hand moved from her hair to her jaw, his thumb brushing against her cheekbone. The touch sent heat racing through her veins. But you won't. And he was right. God help her, he was right. Because beneath the fear and the anger and the absolute insanity of this situation, there was something else. Something that had been growing in the silence, in the loaded glances, in the way he'd protected her from shadows she never saw coming. An attraction that made no sense and defied every logical thought in her head. When he reached for her hand, the one without the cast, Rachel didn't pull away. His fingers threaded through hers, warm and solid and impossibly gentle for someone who'd just declared ownership over her life. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Alessio said quietly. "I'm not even asking you to trust me. I'm just asking you to understand. You saved my life, and I will burn down anyone who tries to take yours." Rachel looked at their joined hands, at the way his thumb traced small circles against her palm, at the impossible situation she'd walked into the moment she heard a scream in the Pinelands 10 years ago. From somewhere beyond the door, she felt rather than saw Domenico's presence, watching, calculating, and she realized with startling clarity that whatever approval he'd just given his son wasn't about respect or pride. It was about strategy, about seeing his heir finally step into the ruthlessness required to hold power. But when Rachel looked back at Alessio, she saw something his father had missed. Beneath the control and the danger and the cold efficiency, there was still the boy who'd clutched a silver locket and given a false name because he'd been taught that truth was weakness. "I'm not on the outside anymore, am I?" Rachel said. Alessio's grip on her hand tightened. "No. I'm in your world now. You've been in my world since the day you pulled me out of that sand." His eyes held hers, intense and unwavering. "You just didn't know it yet." And there it was. The truth that changed everything. Rachel Hayes had saved a life and created a debt that couldn't be repaid. Had walked into a story that was never really about quicksand or environmental reports or even protection. It was about a boy who grew into a dangerous man and never forgot the woman who saw him as human. And now, God help them both, she couldn't forget him either. The 18th of March 2021. The following day, Domenico summoned his son to the private study in Brigantine, the one with the ocean view and the leather-bound books nobody read, the one where decisions that shaped territories were made over drinks that cost more than most people earned in a month. Alessio knew what this was. Recognition, acceptance, the passing of an empire from father to son. Domenico poured 2 glasses of single malt scotch, the kind that had been aging since before Alessio was born. He handed one to his son and raised his own. "The family is yours," Domenico said. They drank. The scotch burned smooth and expensive down Alessio's throat, but something in his father's expression told him this conversation wasn't over. There was more. There was always more. Domenico set his glass down and moved to the window, looking out at the Atlantic. "That locket you were holding, the day the Hayes woman pulled you from the quicksand, you still have it?" Alessio's hand moved instinctively to his chest, though he hadn't worn the locket in years. "Yes." "Good. There's something you need to understand about that piece of jewelry." Domenico crossed to the wall behind his desk, pressed a hidden mechanism, and a panel slid open to reveal a safe. He worked the combination with practiced ease and withdrew a small velvet-lined box. Inside was a second locket, identical to the one Alessio had carried since childhood, tarnished silver, same size, same weight. "Sit down, son." Alessio sat, but every instinct he'd honed over 22 years told him to run. Whatever was coming would change everything. Domenico opened the locket he held. Inside was a photograph, faded, old, a woman with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that looked hauntingly familiar. "You told the Hayes woman your name was Alessio Gentile?" Domenico began, his voice measured. "You used your mother's family name, the one we use for legitimate operations, for paper trails that need to appear clean. I know. But your mother wasn't a Gentile." Domenico's eyes met his, and she wasn't Italian. The floor seemed to shift beneath Alessio's feet. Her name was Katya Rostov. Domenico's voice was clinical now, delivering facts like a coroner listing cause of death. She was a high-ranking accountant for the Izmailovskaya Bratva, the Russian syndicate. She managed their operations along the East Coast, laundering money through businesses most people thought were legitimate. Alessio couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was hearing. "She wasn't my wife," Domenico continued. "She was my intelligence asset, and for a short time, she was my lover. We had an arrangement, information exchanged for protection, but arrangements get complicated when feelings get involved." He paused, and for just a moment, something almost human crossed his face. When she died giving birth to you, I took you, raised you as my own, gave you the Gentile name to hide your real heritage. Why? Alessio's voice came out raw. Because you were mine, not by blood, but by choice. And because keeping you alive meant keeping leverage over people who would have killed you the moment they learned whose son you really were. Domenico reached into the box and withdrew Alessio's locket, the one he'd clutched in the quicksand. He opened it, and Alessio saw for the first time what was inside. Another photograph. A man. Hard features. Cold eyes. Valery Rostov, Domenico said. Your mother's brother. He ran the Bratva's Atlantic City operation in the late 90s and early 2000s. Controlled the docks, the gambling, the protection rackets. He was brilliant, ruthless, and he was my rival. The air left Alessio's lungs. He was killed in a drug deal gone bad in 2003, 2 years before you were born. Domenico's eyes were unflinching. I arranged it, staged it to look like cartel violence. The Bratva never knew. They thought the Mexicans were pushing north, so they pulled back from Atlantic City, gave me the territory I needed. Alessio stared at the photograph, at his uncle, at the man whose blood ran through his veins. You're not Vitiello by blood, son. You're Rostov. Domenico's voice was quiet now, almost gentle. And the debt you think you control with the Hayes woman? That's the least of your problems. The real secret, the one that will keep you in power or get you killed, is that the son of the American capo is the nephew of the Russian mobster the capo murdered. The world tilted. Everything Alessio thought he knew about himself, about his place in this world, shattered into pieces he couldn't reassemble. He stood, his movements mechanical, and left his father's study without another word. The walls of the compound felt like they were closing in. His identity, his heritage, his entire existence was built on lies layered so deep he'd never seen the foundation. He found himself in the small garden behind the safe house, where the air was cold and clean and the stars were just beginning to appear. His hands were shaking, his mind was fractured. And then she was there. Rachel stepped into the garden, wrapped in a borrowed jacket that was too big for her. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with those eyes that had seen him at his most vulnerable, at 12 years old and sinking. She saw it now too, the devastation, the earthquake that had just ripped through the center of him. Alessio? Her voice was soft. He couldn't answer, couldn't find words for what he was feeling. Rachel moved closer, and when she reached for him, he didn't pull away. Her hand found his, her fingers threading through his the same way they had the day before. But this time, it wasn't about attraction or forbidden desire. It was about survival. About two people from different worlds who'd somehow become each other's anchor. Whatever it is, she whispered, you're not alone. Alessio looked down at her, at this woman who'd saved him twice now, once from Quicksand, once from his own father's execution order, and he realized with brutal clarity that she was the only real thing in a world built entirely on lies. He pulled her closer, and she came willingly, wrapping her arms around him despite the cast on her wrist, despite every reason she had to run. They stood there in the garden while the night settled around them, two people bound by secrets and survival and something neither of them could name yet. And in the silence between heartbeats, the unspoken question hung heavy. Could anything real survive in this world? Could love exist where trust was currency and betrayal was inheritance? Alessio didn't have an answer, but for the first time in his life, he wanted to find out. So here we are, Alessio Vitiello, or should I say Alessio Rostov, now carries a secret that could ignite a war between two of the most dangerous crime organizations on the East Coast. And Rachel Hayes? She's no longer just the woman who saved his life. She's the only person who sees him as human in a world built on blood and lies. But here's what keeps me up at night. Can love survive in a world where trust is currency and betrayal is inheritance? The Russian Bratva doesn't forgive. They don't forget. And when they discover the truth about Valery Rostov's murder and who his nephew really is, the consequences won't just be brutal. They'll be absolute. Part 2 is coming, and trust me, you do not want to miss what happens when the past collides with the present. If you're invested in Rachel and Alessio's story, prove it. Smash that like button, drop a comment telling me your prediction for part 2, share this video with everyone you know, and subscribe so you're notified the moment part 2 drops. This story is just beginning.